Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Art of Parenting. This is your host, Jeanne-Marie Pennell, and today I have Jennifer Summerfeldt. And Jennifer and I are going to have a lovely conversation, I do believe, all about birth and, among other things, parenting and so forth. But parenting does start at birth, and it's important to know a bit more. And I know for myself, I do a lot of work about just preparing ourselves and helping women prepare themselves for the experience of birth, which is amazing. So thank you, Jennifer, for being here, and welcome to The Art of Parenting.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
You're welcome. Yeah. So, Jennifer, I always like to start with having my guests define what the art of parenting means to them.
Lucky question. Okay. Give me a moment. So for me, when I hear things around like the art of doing anything, I immediately think about, infusing our embodied being, our soul into the task at hand, and, learning how to be in creative relationship with it. So when I think of the art of parenting, I think about the fact that there are no real rules necessarily. So when I think of art, I don't think of rules, right? I think that we're breaking rules, but there is a guiding principle. And so I would say that it's about learning how to listen to that guiding principle that I believe resides in all of us as a human being, that I believe that we have a guiding principle, we have an intelligence within that doesn't come from books, that doesn't come from taking a million courses online, even if we're selling them, but that it's about learning how to tune in to that wisdom that is shared and following through on that, so that we can really help to elevate the next generation to be, a thriving human being. So that's
beautiful. Yeah.
That's my definition on the top of my head.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And it's beautiful because, what I heard is this idea of having a foundation. Like, yes, art is about breaking rules, but we need to have a foundation to kind of go forth with and that the principles. And from what I heard is those principles is really that inner knowing and our very, very wise intuition. So thank you for that. Yes. And before we get started, Jennifer, I'd love if you could share a little bit about yourself and how you came to do the work that you're doing today.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. And also just for our listeners, if you hear something that sounds like a baby in the background, it's my cat.
Okay.
No babies here. Actually, my baby just moved out yesterday. So I am officially empty nester.
A new chapter of parenting. Yes.
Absolutely. Would love to talk about that.
Yes.
Yeah. So, my story goes all the way back to the 90s and, 97, 98, I was studying, I was in school, in graduate school, studying performance psychology. Back then it was known as sports psychology. And I was an elite athlete. I don't know if we can use that word, but I was a college level athlete training for national, actually the Olympics. And so I got really heavy into sports psychology, learning how to peak perform, mindset preparation. And one of the tools that I used regularly was the tool of visualization or imagery, mind movies. There's different words we can use. So the reason why I share that background is because it really does infuse itself in the work that I've done over the last 20 some years. And I never, ever would have dreamed that, this is where I am today, working in the field of perinatal mental health. And even back then, having children was the furthest thing from my radar. So I was pregnant at a young age. I was 23 years old when I was pregnant, and that was an unplanned pregnancy. And so I decided to take that on as the most important job of my life. And that was
As
all
it is.
instinctive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that pregnancy, you could imagine, there I am, late 90s, and there's not a lot of talk about birth, and I'm not living a granola hippie lifestyle, and I'm deep in the masculine sport field. And so I started to just look at pregnancy and childbirth through the lens of another athletic endeavor, and was like, well, what do I need to do to prepare my body and my mind for this experience? And then what do I need to do to prepare myself for the journey of parenting? So I guess I had some skills, and I applied those skills. And I'm one of those kind of rare stories where I can say that I have listened to my intuition and my, what I would call that inner knowing. I have listened to it from the first time, like the first day I got pregnant. And it really has guided my journey of motherhood and the work that I've done in this field. And, I'm really blessed for that. And so one of the listenings was, like all people, a lot of people, when you discover you're pregnant for the first time, you tend to lean towards the book of, the childbirth book of what to expect when you're expecting.
Mm-hmm.
So I got all excited, picked up that book. I'm kind of rapidly moving through the storyline here because I feel like I have told it, but it's important to know. And so I read that book, was flooded with fear. And nothing really in that book prepared me for what I believed to know to be a physiological event.
Right.
So if I'm preparing to peak perform and I'm reading something that is just flooding me with fear, those two things don't work, right? They don't actually support one another. So I instinctively knew that. And I went, no, something's off here. Something's not right here. And why am I just learning about this now? Like, it was as if I had been severed from the world of childbirth and motherhood. And like, there was this veil between us. Somebody recommended the book Spiritual Midwifery. So I write about the fact that I started with What to Expect When You're Expecting and was immediately thrown into Spiritual Midwifery. So these are, for those who don't know, these are two very opposing books.
Very.
Radically different books.
Yes.
For those of us who aren't privy to what I keep calling the granola path, that book would be quite surprising. And so it was very shocking for me and my system at the time because I hadn't been exposed to that world. And something about what I was reading resonated. I felt it in my body as speaking truth. And so this is how I've learned to guide myself. And what I hope to support people on is listening to that knowing that guides you towards truth. And so this book spoke truth, even though the language was really uncomfortable for me. And, I didn't want my birth experience to be some kind of orgy, which, that book can make you think about.
Right.
So that was the introduction and entry into this world that I have been in since then. And, I was pregnant in 99. So you do the math. And at that point in time, I was working with an obstetrician, asking all these questions. They didn't like the questions. I said, I don't like you. And I made an informed decision, again, listening to that inner knowing. And I did some research on midwifery care, and I hired my midwife. So we had to pay for midwives out of pocket back then.
Yes.
So I sold my motorcycle. I was a low-income mom, and we were a low-income family. And I managed to make enough money, which I think at that time was $1,500. And I hired my midwife, and I had a beautiful home birth. So my first birth experience initiated me into the potential of what can be. And I, had a 4-hour home water birth. And I remember my midwife saying, you need to have 13 children. And I was like, 13 children?
That's a bit much.
I'm an only child. No way. That's never going to happen. But what she was saying to me at that time was, you navigated childbirth really well. And for a young person who was making these choices without external pressure, and remember, we didn't have the internet. I didn't have the internet.
Right.
It just came out, really. And so there was no Googling and there was no social media. So there was there wasn't as much information overload. So there was a bit more quiet that I could listen to. So yeah, so I went on one of those, like, everybody needs to have these experiences. And I think there are listeners out there who could relate to that. And then, there's the opposite as well, which is somebody who's had a traumatic birth experience that initiates them into becoming a voice for other pregnant moms and, wanting to advocate for childbirth. So I think we can enter into this from both extremes.
Right.
And and that just lit a fire, and that fire has been there since. And I have morphed into many different roles, worn many different hats, raised 3 children who are saying, are now all living on their own. And I have a lot to say about the world of parenting and birth. And,
beautiful,
and health.
Beautiful. Yeah. And thank you so much for sharing that, Jennifer, because first of all, when you talk about being an athlete, I know that we often say that, birth, like the experience of giving birth, of laboring, all of that is as if you're running a marathon, right? And that it's that big of an effort for your body, for your mental, for all of it. And we prepare to run a marathon, right? We don't go and just, okay, I'm going to, put on my shoes and go for a run. We prepare it for months ahead. And yet birth seems to be, for many, I'm just having a baby, I'll go to the hospital and, it's going to happen. And to me, I mean, I know it's so important that we have that space where we can delve into what we know about birth, what we've been told about birth, what feels right. I mean, I love that you let your intuition guide you from, what to expect when you're expecting, which to me, honestly, today is outdated.
Does it even still exist?
I think it does. And if I'm not mistaken, the author is a male. So there, right there is like, okay, is a doctor. Like it's someone who is trained to intervene, as opposed to spiritual midwifery, which is 𝐖𝐚𝐥𝐤𝐞𝐝's book, who is a world-renowned midwife who's, worked with so many women and all that. And I can totally relate when you said it's, it's a little crunchy, because she did have, she created this farm where women would come to labor, in nature and all of this. So it does sound very crunchy, but at the same time, it sounds pretty amazing. So it's wonderful. And just the fact that I feel that a lot of women that I've met, and I can speak for myself, is that our own birth experience or witnessing somebody else giving birth will often, like, there's a light bulb that goes off, there's a fire that's lit under us to kind of change the perception that we have around birth. And I think the strength of women and the power of women, right, that oftentimes seems to have been taken away from them, through the birth experience. So thank you for the amazing work you're doing. It's just amazing. One thing that did intrigue me when you were talking about, having this intuition, because you said you were 23, so, quite young. And I have a child, actually, who, well, I can't really say child anymore, but a 23-year-old. And I think he's pretty intuitive, but still, how do you feel that intuition grew? Like, what was your upbringing to have such a strong intuition? Because I feel like, honestly, children are extremely intuitive, right? We're born with a mighty intuition, but I feel like it's somewhat beaten out of us as we evolve, as we mature. And it sounds like you were able to really hold on to it, and it did wonders for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Nobody's asked me that. And I think about it a lot, actually, because I actually come from a significant primary trauma in which my biological father died when I was very young, and he died early. I think he was 26 when he died of cancer, and very rapid. And when he died, I was under 2. I was just under 2. And so I was born into, I say, death and dying. So I was born into grief. I was born into the fear of sickness. I was born into death. And I was, also born into the masks that come with that, right? So I'm also an only child. So I held all of that. So something that I believe came out of that, and I've only come to see that more recently in my later years, is that 2 things could have happened, right? One is I could have completely dissociated and kind of floated away because of how much feeling there was in my immediate environment. But that didn't happen. What happened is I believe that I maintained a foot between both worlds. And meaning, for those that believe that, there's a veil that kind of separates us from, let's say, the world of spirit and the world of this 3D reality. And I think that I've been navigating both of those worlds most of my life, but not having the language to articulate it or understand it. So I have always lived a little bit as an edge walker, you could say, maybe somewhat of a rebellious nature, but not actually wanting to be rebellious. Like, that's the irony of it all is, my instinct isn't to, point the finger and say, F you. The instinct is, I just have to follow truth.
Right. Right.
And I could just see that line through my whole life. And so there were many incidents that are similar to that, and I don't have to go into those, but that's what I believe happened. It definitely wasn't because it was nurtured or even celebrated. If anything, it was confusing to most of my family. And, you just kind of become the odd one or the black sheep or that.
Right,
so
right.
There was always that. It's Jennifer, like, you're expecting this. So to some extent, it wasn't surprising. But I feel like in those experiences, especially in hindsight now, when I look back and I think about, wow, like, that was so courageous of me at 23 to listen to my instinct and something that was guiding me. And that has continued throughout, from even just how I chose to parent right away. The choices I made right away. Again, they weren't informed because I was raised in what I would call an attachment-based culture. I was not raised that way. But my instincts kicked in right away. And, this led me to research hormones at birth. This led me to understand our attachment circuitry. This is why I'm so fascinated by the nervous system, right? And, so soon thereafter, my birth experience, because I had an instinct of physiological childbirth, my hormones were intact. What does that mean, right? It means that I was flooded with oxytocin, which, for those of you who don't know, is the love hormone, the bonding hormone, the social engagement hormone, right? So I was flooded with oxytocin. I was flooded with the endorphins, which are our pleasure hormones, right? I had all that cocktail. I had the prolactin, which is prolactation, which is also considered to be the mothering hormone, right? So I had all these hormones. I even had the catecholamines that, which is a rush of adrenaline. Those are your adrenaline hormones. And they're intended to produce the fetal ejection reflex, which is the instinctive bodily response to pushing your baby out. And I had that too. I had that full instinct of the body's urge to push versus being told it's time to push now.
Right. Right.
So my body kind of just did those things, which is why I'm fascinated to understand, what is going on here physiologically. So when my baby was born, instinctively, I was like, I'm not putting my baby in another room away from me, and I remember saying that. I'm just like, no, this baby is coming, like, right next to me.
Right, right.
And again, that wasn't something that I had been raised with. Of course, there was all the fear of, co-sleeping is going to cause baby death and, like, all that. And so I just listened to those instincts. And so I co-slept, and against all pushback, right? Like, tons of pushback.
Right.
I did breastfeed. I breastfed for a really long time. I let them child wean. I made decisions that I would have never made. My personality was one that I did not want to stay at home with my kids. My personality is like, no, I'm going to go out. I'm going to make the money. I'm a feminist of the 90s, And my biology just kicked in and it was like, nope, nobody's raising my kids.
Right.
So I sacrificed financial gain to stay home with my children, and I did that. And that was all instinctive. That was not consciously driven because I was told I should do that.
Right. And to me, I mean, what you described also, with the birth and like you say, the whole hormone cocktail and everything. I was actually listening to someone this morning. It's just because there were no interventions too, right? You had that initial instinct to not go with the OBGYN, but to go with a midwife, which is and maybe you can take a moment to maybe for those who might not know, explain maybe the difference between midwives and OBGYN, like why, maybe a pregnant woman who's listening might choose to go one way or the other. But for me, just that instinct right there from saying, no, I'm going to change provider. I'd rather, sell my motorcycle and have a home birth, which is,
radical.
That is radical. But I mean, kudos to you. Like how wise, you were at that age to just say, no, this is what I'm being told, what my inner knowing is telling me to do. And this is what I'm going to do. And because you did that, you were able to have that, natural, beautiful birth and have that, immediate attachment and all of that, which unfortunately today, I mean, I think there's so much intervention of us wanting to manipulate birth when it's a natural occurrence, right? It's our body knows how to give birth. We don't need to intervene, except of course, if there's, some sort of emergency, but those are few and far between. And yet we are intervening more than we ever have. And unfortunately, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but here in the US, the, maternal mortality rate is unheard of for, a country that is, industrialized, as we say. But yeah, I'm kind of diverting, but I'm just saying, like, kudos to you for just following that intuition. And I just want to say that to all of, those listening and watching, is just, please just trust yourself. Like, you know best. You and your baby are partners in this adventure, and you two know best. And it's really about honing in on that, whether it's a meditation practice, whether it's, however you want to nurture that intuition, is so, so important to listen to it. So, yeah. I
think just to jump in there, a couple things. So first of all, 𝐖𝐚𝐥𝐤𝐞𝐝 did write about the maternal mortality rate in the US. She has a book out on that. That was a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago. So if people wanted to look into that, there is some research done there. And then also you had asked to maybe speak about the difference between obstetrician and midwives. And I would go a step further. Something that I like to talk about are the different paradigms of birth and the caregivers that fall within those different paradigms, and how important it is for you to know what your paradigm is. Like where you feel most safe and most comfortable and why, and how that aligns up with your value system is critical. But what often happens is that we're not informed about these different paradigms of birth.
Exactly.
And I say that because there is over here, let's just call this industrialized childbirth. Let's call it the medicalization of childbirth, where that's your typical birthing experience that most people are aware of, which is, you're choosing to have an obstetrician, you're maybe even taking the hospital childbirth classes, you're okay with interventions, you're okay even having your baby delivered. Right.
So, right. You're okay with being induced. You're okay with, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't want to make that paradigm wrong.
No.
I lived far over here. So for a while, I used to think that that paradigm, was wrong, and it's not wrong. It's important that you understand what that paradigm includes, that they're motivated by fear and litigation and money, and they're motivated to manage and control and take charge of your experience. And so there is no trusting in the birth. There is no trusting in you. There's a transactional exchange that's happening there. And for some, that feels very safe.
Right.
Right. And
Right.
it feels very comfortable to say, I would like to hand my baby and my body over to you as the expert to manage my experience and deliver me my baby.
Yes.
And I think that if that's you, if that feels comfortable for you as a listener, not you, that you need to own that and name that and understand that that means you're going to get a certain kind of experience.
Yes.
And that will reduce the risk of trauma and psychological trauma. It might not reduce the risk of physical trauma, because there can be physiological trauma through those interventions, and that might not be mitigated, but it can reduce psychological trauma.
And you're saying that because you've prepared yourself, because you've made that choice, correct?
Yes. So if you understand what your values are, if you're very clear on what you need to feel safe, if you recognize that that paradigm of birth is going to provide you with a certain kind of care and a certain kind of outcome,
right,
and you're okay with that, then own the fact that you're okay with that, right? So don't expect anything different. And usually that results in somebody feeling quite satisfied, right? I have met a lot of moms who are very happy with the fact that they were kind of put along that conveyor belt. Some people talk about it like a conveyor belt, right? Where they were just sort of like put into the system, and the system then, produced a live, healthy baby.
Right.
And that's good for them. They didn't look at birth or somebody who chooses that consciously. They're not entering the birth experience to have an initiating transformative event.
Right.
They're not entering it to see, how incredibly blissful or, powerful the birth can be. That language to them won't resonate.
Right. So
and
true.
So, yeah. So I call that, one paradigm. I call that the medicalization of childbirth paradigm. And here's what it includes. And what you're kind of preparing for is how to, what to know is going to happen so that you're psychologically prepared for those things.
Right.
Then there's another paradigm, and this one is where we would land most professional midwives. So the professionalization of midwifery, which was born out of a lot of conflict between the medicalization of birth, and then there was always an underground midwifery movement. And then, of course, being the underdog, the midwives want to rise up. They want to be recognized as a profession. They want to have insurance coverage, right? Of course. So they want people to access their services. And that's more of like a humanistic paradigm, where a lot of people really love this paradigm because they feel like it's more centered on the pregnant mom, right? And there's more time allotted, there's more care allotted. You're given this option. You're given sort of the illusion of choice, I say, right? So in this paradigm, it's like, here are your options, but those options only go so far, because if certain risk factors show up, then you're risked out of care.
That's true.
And this becomes problematic for some pregnant people. And but within that paradigm, you're getting more compassionate care. There's more of a trust in the birthing process. Generally speaking, when you hire a professional or registered midwife, who are most often, you have the option to birth at home, to birth in a birthing center, or to birth in the hospital. So here in Canada, for example, all of our midwives who are registered midwives have hospital privileges, right? So a lot of people end up birthing in a hospital with a midwife.
Okay.
So this is the second paradigm. It's still very much managed by protocols, by procedures, and it's still managed by litigation and fear. So that's still all there. And but there's more. There's an arrangement of opportunities, right? So most people choose that path. And what happens though, a lot of the clients that we work with are the clients that chose midwifery care because they believed that maybe they were going to get an 𝐖𝐴𝐚𝐥𝐤𝐞𝐝. Mm-hmm. And they end up with more of a medicalized approach to care. And therefore, they didn't get the birth experience that they had hoped for. And there's an added component, which is now I'm surprised and shocked because I didn't think that my midwife would show up in the capacity that she did, right? And generally speaking, all the midwives I know are predominantly women. So that tends to happen a lot where there's like a big disappointment because somebody thinks, well, I'm not choosing paradigm number 1. I'm choosing paradigm number 2. I'm hiring a midwife, or I'm using a midwife through the system. And I'm expecting that I'm going to be treated differently. And if I'm treated the same, and if my birth is managed in the same way, then what happened here? And so there's a bigger fall. And this is usually where we are experiencing more psychological trauma after that experience, maybe more physiological trauma, but there's just this deeper level of grief and disappointment. And generally moms in that category internalize then, well, there must be something wrong with me and my body. And so whereas that doesn't necessarily show up in paradigm number 1 as often.
Right.
Sometimes it
because what you're saying is that because like in paradigm number 1, you know what to expect, right? You're choosing to go, the I don't want to say highly medicalized, but you're saying I trust the medical field to deliver my baby, and I'm trusting this person or this system,
and I'm okay with whatever might happen.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then for the second paradigm where I'm choosing a midwife, thinking that because I'm choosing a midwife, it's not going to be as medicalized. And it's so true because I'm a birth doula, so I've assisted, as an observer of birth, and it's true. Midwives that are far, like there's a very large spectrum of how midwives show up at birth, right? So yeah, fascinating.
Yeah. And so this is why I say it's really important to know what paradigm you're in, and then it's really important to know what paradigm your caregiver is in.
Right.
So, and again, this isn't to make anybody wrong. It's actually to be more transparent, which then actually puts us in the driver's seat so we can make a conscious choice. Right. So I just want to speak to the third paradigm because I think that's really important. And, this third paradigm is a movement that came out of the second paradigm, and let's call it the free birth paradigm, right? And so I actually was I can honestly say that I was at the beginning of this movement, the consciously driven movement of the free birth paradigm. Like there's always been for eons, right? We've just been birthing, but like where it is an act of conscious choice to say no to having a primary caregiver at your birth experience. So free birth movement, just for those of you who have never heard of this is where you are radically taking responsibility and ownership of your birth experience without hiring a professional to be in attendance to your birth. That's what the free birth movement always was. And, I was at Janine Parvati's workshop where she showed the very first VHS video of this clear road to birth. That's what really initiated the free birth movement before social media got hold of it. And, it was all about these families that were taking radical responsibility for their birth experiences, and they did not want to have a professional in attendance. And what's happened though since is that there's a bit of a gray area. So there are the radical free birthers who birthed unattended, unassisted, right? So let's call the third paradigm the free birth or unassisted birthing paradigm. I birthed my third child in that paradigm, so I can speak to it, and I can also speak to some of my resistance to it. So I have kind of birthed the two latter paradigms.
Right.
So what's happened though is because there's a lot of people who are unsatisfied with their caregiving within that second paradigm, right? Then they're swinging to the free birth paradigm because it's like, well, I can't get the caregiver I want to support me in the way that I want. So I'm going to go over here, but I still want to have a caregiver present. And this is where more of the underground, let's say, traditional birth attending movement is coming from, or you're getting radical birth attendants, or you're getting doulas who are showing up and they're present to your birth, but they're not playing the role as your primary caregiver.
Right.
And, and I have walked I've worn all those hats. And so I know what the potential is over there. And I know it's radically different than the paradigm over here that I talked about, that first paradigm, right? So we've got this spectrum when we're talking about birth. And so why I'm saying it's important that as a pregnant person where you land, first of all, is because that's going to align with your values. If you're choosing free birth, for example, because you are terrified of having a traumatic birth experience, you're making a choice out of fear.
Right.
You're not making a choice out of that place of informed knowing, that intuitive knowing, right? Any choice out of fear is usually a bad recipe. So it's important to recognize that. Secondly, if you know you want a caregiver present, so you're in the second paradigm, but you, let's say, would like to have a home birth, in an ideal world, what we would like to be able to do is interview our caregivers because you're paying for them.
Exactly.
Whether it's taxpayer dollars or out of your pocket because you sold your motorcycle, you're paying for it.
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so you want to know what to ask. You want to know, is this person aligned with my value system? Is this person aligned with the paradigm of birth that I want to give birth within? And unfortunately, what ends up happening is this is where we have a lot of clashes. So somebody ends up compromising, right? And so the compromise is either, okay, well, I'll still work with the caregivers, even though I don't feel necessarily safe with them, or I'm worried they're going to intervene in ways that I don't want them to. Or the other compromise is I'm going to fire all my caregivers and I'm going to radically birth unassisted and then come up against some of the challenges that can come up there where you then transport yourself to a hospital. And then that's a whole other story, right? Because that's a huge gap. And then the doula, I'm sure you speak about that. So that is kind of why I think it's important to understand that there are different caregivers. Even an obstetrician could be more on the kind of unassisted free birthing side of things, right? I know obstetricians who think that way, who would support you in that process. So we don't want to just say because you're an obstetrician, you're going to be over here. That's not necessarily true. So it's important that you, know your values, know the different paradigms of birth, and then know how to find the caregiver to support you. Yes. And that only comes from being transparent, right? You have to be courageous enough to have those hard conversations. Like, let's say you want a free birth. Well, what if I tell you I don't want my heart rate monitored or something, right? Like, how do they respond to that? Or if you're over here in the middle, right, that you're kind of negotiating, well, what happens if I go overdue? And what are your protocols around that? And here's what I'm comfortable with. What are you comfortable with? Like, it would just change the experience.
Right. And I think, it really all comes down to really the knowledge of first of all, like knowing what birth is and understanding that you have choices, like you've explained our different choices and tuning in with, first of all, like what it feels like to you. But I feel also sometimes the compromises also comes with our partners. Sometimes I know I've worked with parents where she might want to stay at home, but he definitely, can't handle that. So, so they compromise, things like that. But there's that. But it's just really, for me, it really comes down to educating ourselves, having that knowledge, and then really doing your homework, like figuring out, do your research on the birth center or the hospital or the midwife that's going to come at home, or, like you say, the free birth, because in the long run, it is your choice, and you have to do your homework and do your research, just like you would hire somebody to, I don't know. I mean, it's, we take time to hire somebody to clean our house, and we're nitpicking about it, but we don't take the time to, really interview the person who might be next to us when we deliver our baby. So very, very important. Yeah.
I would agree.
Yeah. One thing that came up a few times, and I'm being conscious of time, but I think we're going to go over time on this one. It's too good. You talked about birth trauma. And one thing, that I guess my thing is like, how do we avoid that? And I think we've talked a lot about, first of all, just educating ourselves, informing ourselves, tuning in, and all of that. But how, if there has been a birth trauma, and for me, like, I'll speak like of experience. So I have two children, 27 and 23-year-old. I came to birth very excited, feeling that it was, a natural thing. I had always been told by my elders, by my mother, that it was a beautiful experience and so forth. And so I came wanting that. I feel that both were definitely hijacked. I don't know if they were traumatic in any way, but they were definitely hijacked. And, looking back, it's because I didn't probably set my boundaries or know the paradigm. I wish I had had this conversation before. But how does one kind of come back from that and process that? Because I think that must be so heavy to come into parenthood, into motherhood, with that heavy baggage right from the start, right? Of feeling that it's not at all what you expected. It's I mean, even as a birth doula, I've assisted birth where I'm traumatized as an observer. So I can't imagine the mother, and it's hard.
Yeah.
So, because I know that that's part of your work, right? Of that whole nervous system and how to recuperate from that.
Yeah. Correct. It is part of the world that I ended up entering into. Like I said, the pendulum swung, and I thought, I realized what I was actually doing was trying to find the ways to mitigate harm in birth, right? So back then we didn't have the word birth trauma.
Okay.
But we had the words of like obstetrical violence or obstetrical harm. Those were kind of the words that were used. And now the word birth trauma is quite readily used. And so a lot of my work was all about ways to reduce violence in birth, ways to mitigate harm for both mom and baby, which ultimately meant, how do we mitigate birth trauma? And so here I am on the other side now going, okay, so supporting moms in labor wasn't necessarily the way to do that. And so now it's supporting them mentally and emotionally afterwards. And first of all, the important thing to understand is, I think you also touched on it, is that you can have a disappointing birth experience that is not traumatic. So
Right.
you could have a birth experience that did not turn out the way that you had hoped. Maybe interventions were part of that experience, and it's right. It's expected and normal and okay for you to feel grief, to feel anger, to even feel fear. And those emotions need to be digested. They need to be metabolized. Because you're feeling those emotions does not mean that you have birth trauma. And the other thing that I think is really important to understand is that trauma has to have multiple factors associated with it. So one is, yes, there's physiological trauma. So there's the trauma that happened to your body. And let's say through the experience of childbirth, many people have experienced trauma to the body, and the body will hang on to that as an incomplete stress response, right? So there's the physiological nervous system's, aspect to trauma in which your survival system went into a state of alarm and never had that opportunity to complete that survival stress state, never came to completion or closure.
Okay.
And didn't run its whole course. So that's that kind of physiological embodied side of what's happening, that idea of your body keeps a score, right? Like that our body is having an experience and we need to complete that. Then we also have a psychological component to it, which is the story we're telling ourselves, which is the way in which the mind made sense out of that experience.
Right.
And that adds an additional layer to an already traumatic embodied experience. And that story, often is a story about yourself, and it's usually a limiting belief. And I say these are the lies that we've been programmed to tell ourselves. They're not truths. But when we believe them, it activates that state. And then we just stay in that survival stress state. We stay in a state of alarm, and eventually that deteriorates our health, deteriorates our physical health, deteriorates our mental health, deteriorates our emotional and social health. And usually when we reach out for support, it's because we've been deteriorated in all those areas, right? And then we internalize that there must be something wrong with me. So those two factors have to be associated with it. And the third factor that has to be associated with it is that you perceived and neurosaved that you were in a situation that was life-threatening. That the situation itself had to induce enough, I shouldn't say enough, but that the situation itself induced terror. It induced a high degree of fear that you were in harm's way or your baby was in harm's way, and that there was the risk of death. When that's there, even if it's momentarily, right, that there's a risk of harm and that you could not escape it. So the key trigger is you could not escape it. And of course, when you think of birth, you can understand that this all can show up. Right?
Definitely.
So it's very common that those who've had, especially interventative births, can experience those births as having been traumatic. And those symptoms can show up in the postpartum.
Right.
And if they're only assessing the postpartum with those symptoms, through, let's say, the Edinburgh score, right? Like that's like a typical assessment for postpartum mental health. And they're missing out on the context of that birth experience, then the mom can be misdiagnosed or mislabeled and then identify themselves as having postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety, when what they're actually experiencing is a result of and the symptoms of
the trauma.
A nervous system that's trapped in a traumatic stress response.
Right.
And so this is something I've been trying to bring to the forefront, is that typically I would say most of the symptoms that we're seeing showing up in the postpartum that we would label as postpartum depression or a mood disorder most likely is contributed to a survival stress state that was activated prenatally or during the birth experience that did not have that opportunity to complete that cycle. And go ahead.
Excuse me. Yeah, when you say complete the cycle, I'm confused at what that looks like or what that means.
That's a good question. So let's just do a brief little teaching on that. So I want us to imagine ourselves as biological animals, which we are. So as, if we look at the animal kingdom, right? Or how do we come up with that word kingdom? But if we look at the animal world, if an animal is under stress,
Yes.
because there's a predator, and or there's a reason for it to be in a stress response, it's going to go into, its nervous system is going to respond accordingly, and it will increase that system into a sympathetic state, right? So you're going to get flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and that information, that energy material, right, is intended to mobilize that animal so that it can either fight, right, for survival, or run for survival. So those are the two main ones that are, when the sympathetic system is activated, we're either running or fighting.
Right.
And that is considered our mammalian system. Now, if we can't run or we can't fight, this is where we move towards collapse. And in nervous system,
what we call the freeze response.
Well, collapse is a bit different than freeze. So freeze, we actually say is like a momentary, like we know what freeze is. It's a momentary, sudden, like catatonic state where nothing is happening. Right. And it's like the deer in the headlight thing, right? Where, and I'm sure all of us could think of moments where that might have happened, right? Mm-hmm. So collapse is actually what happens when we go towards what's called the dorsal vagal state, which is the most primitive aspect of our nervous system for protection and survival. So dorsal is, now we're going into this state of immobilize, collapse, shut down, hide, slow everything down so that we are now what's called feigning death to prevent death. So we are pretending to be dead, but this is not psychological. This is an embodied response to survival stress. Okay.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Completing the response is, now that we've been flooded, we either escaped through fighting or running and or collapsing. So I want you to imagine you're in the wild, the predator leaves. You don't get eaten. I know this is very graphic,
but it's
right. So, or you're in the wild and you had heard something and the body responds to it, and then you realize it was just the wind. So then you settle your system back down, right? So, so let's imagine that the predator leaves. The system knows it survives. So it's not like the mind is thinking, I'm alive. Your embodied system knows it's alive. It knows the predator is no longer there. So it instinctively completes that response. By completing that response, it means that it now discharges all of that energy from the embodied system. And usually, and this really comes from Peter Levine's work. So a lot of he speaks about this a lot. I think it was Waking the Tiger or something. So the whole point is that energy gets discharged from the body, and that usually looks like the animal shaking, bolting, or roaring really loud, right? It's that last ditch effort. So it kind of wakes up, right? And it's like, okay, I just escaped. And then it's like, gets that energy out. Well, as a human species, generally speaking, we never complete that cycle. We don't discharge it because we have this prefrontal cortex that has been socially programmed to not be too much.
Right.
Don't scream too loud. Don't roar too loud. Don't wail too loud. Don't shake like in convulsions. That you're going to look crazy, right? You can't hit, can't kick, can't bite. And, if you run, you're going to look, like a wild banshee, let's say, right? So we have been conditioned to put the lid on. We don't complete that response, right? If we were to let the instinct take over and we didn't have these social conditions, right? The mammalian response would be, that's why you could flip a car. Right, that energy of flipping that's where that energy is coming from. So when that energy gets trapped in the nervous system and it doesn't get the opportunity to complete that cycle, and now we've got a psychology, we've got this prefrontal cortex that's putting meaning on it and telling a story about it and making sense out of it. We're just adding fuel to the fire. And now we've got all this material inside of us that we're feeling. And we feel too much, right? We don't know what to do with it. So we either pop out, shut down, explode, or implode. And so what we have to learn to do is how to move that material without shutting down, popping out, exploding, or imploding, knowing it's safe enough to feel what I'm feeling. So I can discharge that energy. Typically, that comes through tears.
Right. Right. Or yeah, shaking it out, or screaming, or tears, or big sob. It's true. Like they're evacuating it, like having that.
Right. And what we also know is that if you have a safe person with you, if you have a person that you feel connected to, a person that's an anchor in that space, a person that witnessed something, witnessed your experience, and you can rest in their presence, you can discharge that energy quite quickly, and that will also reduce the risk of trauma.
Right.
So you could go through something highly stressful, what we might label as traumatic, but if on the other side, you're received in that container of care, with a nervous system that is safe enough for you to rest in, then you can move that and it not be trapped.
Right. So basically, from what I'm understanding, is that the trauma really is the trapped experience, like not being able to process it and not being able to go, okay, now I'm safe. Like,
right, it's over.
Whatever
now.
You need to do, it's done. I'm safe. I can move about, but we keep it and we regurgitate it and we dwell on it and
generally because we don't have that other. We don't have a culture of connection that's caring for us on the other side, right? So as a doula, you play a significant role, I believe, because you could be that anchor. Right. And so I like to say that because, I feel like in the world of trauma right now, where everything is trauma informed,
right?
A lot of people use that word quite flippantly, and you might have had a disappointing birth experience and you're labeling it as traumatic. And, it could be that there's grief there and that grief needs to be held and the disappointment needs to be acknowledged, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's trauma.
Right.
And that there is also a way to experience highly stressful experiences, even experiences that are terrifying, and for it not to be embedded in as trauma. So like, in other words, it's not about controlling the outside world to prevent this. It's about knowing that there's a way for us to actually ride the waves of life, to ride the stressors of life. And it doesn't have to be trauma.
Right. Beautiful. Very, very powerful. And I must say also, like, I can't help myself think about childhood when you were saying all of this, because for me, it starts with how we parent our children, because they go through, what we think is nothing, but for them, it's a big trauma, or it's, it's an experience. And we go, don't worry about it or move on or whatever. To me, just what you were talking about, just, being that safe person so that they can process it is so, so important for us to, be emotionally safe and intelligent and so forth. Yeah.
Well, that would be the role of the parent, right? The parent being that safe anchor.
Exactly.
And knowing that whatever their child is processing is not too much for them. No. So I always say to parents, like, your role is to, first of all, learn how to do this for yourself so that you can then be okay with your child feeling what they're feeling, right? Instead of, we're so quick to put the cap on it, to manage it, to control it, to contain it. And that's, that's because we haven't learned how to do it ourselves. So, that to me is also part of the art of parenting.
Definitely. Beautiful. This has been wonderful, Jennifer. Thank you so much. And I always like to wrap up with a kind of a more personal question to bring back to your own parenting. And so earlier you mentioned that you were pregnant in 1999. So let's go back there. What wise words? I mean, And I must say you were very wise back then already. So, but what wise words would you tell yourself, tell that 23-year-old, what wise word would you tell yourself knowing all that you know today?
Well, the one thing I always say I would tell my younger self as a parent, and I tell my kids this too, is to allow myself to relax into motherhood without worrying about trying to make money, even as a low-income mom, because it didn't matter anyways. So I was very distracted with trying to find alternative ways to bring in a little bit of an extra income. And that distracted me from really being present with my children. And that time just went by so fast, and it did not evolve me financially. So in a way, I look at it as something that got in the way of me really being present and deepening that relationship in those younger years with my kids. And I would say there's going to be a time when your kids are older that you can return to that. Right. So just rest in that role right now. Rest in the role of motherhood. That's what I would tell myself.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. Any parting words that you would like to leave our listeners, our viewers with today?
No, it was wonderful being here. And I think I said a lot in terms of the journey of parenting.
So rich. Yeah.
If people are interested in finding more of what it is that I offer and my team offers, of course, you can find us at therapyformoms.ca. So that's in Canada. And, there's also online programming that you can check out. And, I think I would just
perfect. And I'll have all those in the show notes. And I'm sure many will reach out. Well, again, thank you so much for making the time to be here and sharing your journey and your wisdom with us.
Thank you.